Folks, we're here at Varnum Town, North Carolina, this wonderful little fishing village that we have here in Brunswick County. My guest is Howard Varnum, appropriately enough named. Nice to have you with us, Mr. Varnum.
Thank you.
You grew up here.
Yes, I did.
Let's talk a little bit about the history, and it is a rich history, and you're growing up here in Varnum Town. The Varnums first came here several centuries ago.
Yes, I'm actually the 6th generation of Varnums.
All right.
And the first one came down, his name was Roland Varnum. He came down from Bowdingham, Maine in the early 1800s he was a shipbuilder.
Right.
And he came down to get a load of lumber, longleaf pine lumber, to take back to Maine to build sailboats.
And tell me he stayed.
Well, he got, lo and behold, they got shipwrecked.
Okay.
Ran aground on near Ballhead, swam ashore on Ballhead, and never went back.
Wow, that's a great beginning.
Great beginning.
Great beginning to this interview as well. So for the last 150 years or so, Varnum Town has been a little pearl here in our county, a fishing community with fishing of what's the fishing for?
They do a lot of oystering and clamming.
And shrimp.
And shrimp.
Right.
Yes, shrimping is probably the largest commodity now that comes in the river.
Yeah.
All of the large shrimp boats that you can see that's tied up at the dock, and some on the railway over here getting ready for shrimp season to open back up. But shrimping is the biggest livelihood of the commercial fleet now.
And behind us is the Lockwood Folly River.
Yes, it is.
Let's talk about that for just a second.
Okay. Well, the Lockwood Folly River is a federal navigation project that came into being in the late 1800s by the Rivers and Harbors Act, and it's a 8-foot channel from the ocean bar all the way to Supply, it stops at the bridge that crosses the Lockwood Folly River on 211.
I know just where that is.
A mile or so from the stoplight at 17.
Right.
But the Federal Navigation Project ends there. Now it's a 150-foot wide channel, and now the ocean bar is an 8-foot channel in its early creation, but in the late 1980s, when Congressman Charlie Rose was in office, had it reauthorized to 12 feet deep because 8 feet was not deep enough for the large shrimp boats to get in.
I want our viewers to know that the reason you know a whole lot about this is that you were the Chief of Navigation for the Corps of Engineers.
Yes, I was.
And that's a rich history in and of itself. You're Mr. Varnum, V-A-R-N-A-M.
Yes.
And there's an N-U-M as well.
Yes.
Now, I know there's a whole lot of talk about the different spellings, but did you all come from the same Varnum?
Whether we want to admit it or not, we're all related.
Okay.
Whether it's a U or an A makes no difference.
Yeah.
But now my dad had a simple explanation for that.
Okay.
He had 14 brothers and sisters, and 12 of them spelled it with an A, and there was 2 U's. And my dad's theory was when the babies were born, the old granny wrote it in the family Bible, and she didn't close the loop on the A on 2 of them. And that's what he's told me all my life. And that's about as reasonable explanation as I can give you.
I think that's a reasonable explanation altogether. I'm a McCallum, and we're MACs and we're MCs, but we all came from the same clan.
We all came from the same Varnum.
Let's let our viewers know that so many of the residents here in Varnum Town are still Varnums or direct descendants of the Varnums.
Yes, that's correct. When my dad passed away this past November. He was 94 years old, and he was a historian.
Wow.
He had, and when my mom passed away about 10 years ago, my sister told my dad, said, "Daddy, do us a favor, we'll never remember all the ins and outs of Varnamtown.
Right.
Write it down." So one night that my dad couldn't sleep, he took a legal pad and wrote 28 pages.
Come on.
Of history of Varnum Town and the Varnums and all of that. And I read some of his scribblings. Of course, some of it was repetitive.
Sure.
But I found out that my family tree was a vine. It didn't have too many branches.
It wasn't a tree so much as a vine.
That's right. It was either a Galloway, a Varnum, or a Dixon were the three branches of my family, and those were the predominant families of the early families of the community here in Varnum Town, and of course there was Lancasters too.
Well, that leads me to this question. Talk a little bit, we talked before we went on the air, about your growing up right here in this little community.
Oh yes, I tell you, I wouldn't trade my childhood of growing up here. In fact, I lived here until I graduated from high school and went on to college. But there's not enough money in the world to change my growing up in Varnum Town.
But you spent your early and teen years right here,
Absolutely.
right here on the water.
Absolutely, fishing in the river, shrimping I used to shrimp with my uncle on the Windy Lee. And I'd shrimp in the summertime, and we'd go out and stay for a day or so at a time, and come back to the fish house, Robinson and Thompson Seafood,
yeah,
and unload the shrimp, gas up, and take on ice, and it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning, and you'd get about 2 hours of sleep and go back out again.
Now you just said the word T-I-M-E, and you said time.
Time.
And I normally would say time, but that leads us to the fact that a lot of residents of Varnum Town speak in an unusual, and I say this very respectfully, accent. Let's talk about that. The term that I was given is high tider.
Yes.
Now,
us out. My wife said we were so isolated for so long that we had our own dialect. But
well, it is unique, though. Isn't it?
It is, and it's not only found here, but also the fishing communities up in Carteret County, Atlantic and Sea Level down in those areas also have the same accents. But it just dates back to Old English.
That's what I understand. It's an accent several hundred years old, or much older.
Or much older. That's correct.
Just beyond my line of vision is a large shrimp boat that's out of the water.
Yes.
And I want our viewers to know that there are only a few places in the county where they have a railway system that can actually bring the large boats out of the water for maintenance.
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, there's a marine railroad, and it's hooked up to large winches, and it floats onto the frame, and it's pulled out, and that's how they do the painting. They'll getting the boat ready for the next fishing season. They'll bring the boat up, do scraping, may have to replace some woodwork or something like that, put a fresh coat of paint on them, and get them ready for the next season.
But I noticed it was called a marine railway that literally rolls up out of the water.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can see the trolley system. Well, its tide's a little bit high right now, but it looks almost like train tracks.
Right. That
go out, and the frame goes back out. They'll float it up on the railway and pull it back out.
And during the time we've been here, of course, we have the large commercial boats, but we have small boats coming and going. Older guys that are just out here fishing for flounder or other things.
Absolutely. Right now, they're probably fishing for trout or drum.
And this dock is very much, or this area is very much available for those that want to bring their boats here.
A public area right here, a boat ramp, and there's the town has two parking areas for the boat traffic at no cost.
For anyone that wants to come this way. Yeah.
Yes.
I've learned that you have an annual oyster roast that's been here a long, long time.
Absolutely, at Dixon Chapel Methodist Church. I think I was about 5 years old when we started the oyster roast at Dixon Chapel. My job was to keep the oyster eaters full of cornbread. Okay. The ladies had the old frying pans in the back. They'd fry up the cornbread, and all of the little kids, we weren't large enough to roast the oysters, so we actually helped out by carrying pickles and cornbread to the oyster eaters.
And that tradition continues through today.
Continues right on through today. It's usually the first weekend in November.
Another item that I learned in my little bit of research was the old Varnum's General Store. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, my great uncle Harry had a store which is located about a half mile up the river from where we're at right now, and this was called Dixon's Landing.
Okay.
And his landing up there was Varnum's Landing.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a big 2-story general store with a dock, and he had some fishing boats that tied up there, but he also had a small boat that he captained, and he would take it and go to Brooks Brothers in Wilmington, sail it up the Cape Fear River, and bring supplies back to keep his general store stocked for the community.
Well, that's what I want our viewers to know, that not only here, but Charlotte and other areas along the coast, they were served, at least initially, by water.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And
because the roads simply weren't developed at that time.
And most of that was before the Intercoastal Waterway.
Okay.
The Intercoastal Waterway that came through in the early 30s, prior to that, the boats would sail out of Lockwood's Folly Inlet and come back in at Southport and sail up the Cape Fear River.
Yeah.
We have a very large population of patrons who need large print materials. Some of our patrons only read large print materials and cannot read anything else. And we had a very small percentage of our collection that was large print. In fact, 8% of our collection is large print materials, but 11% of what circulates in and out of this library is large print materials. So there was a need to increase the number of large print books for our patrons to entertain them, diversity of reading, improve their quality of life. We were able to purchase 80 books with the grant money that we received from ATMC, and that money purchased fiction as well as nonfiction, as well as biographies. We are very grateful to ATMC and the grant that they provided to us so that we could purchase those large print books for our patrons. It gives them the opportunity to have access to reading materials that they would not otherwise have. Fiction stories, as well as nonfiction and biographies, so that our patrons can continue to interact with the world around them through the printed word.
Okay, we're back with Howard Varnum. Howard, one of the things that I learned in speaking with you and others is that this community also has a rich history of boat building. Let's talk about that for a second.
Well, it's ironic that the first Varnum came from Maine for lumber to take back to Maine to build boats.
Right.
Well, that also maybe inspired some of his children and grandchildren to build boats here. In fact, where we're at right now, there was a boatyard.
Okay.
And there was another boatyard about a mile up the river, and there was a couple of boatyards on the Intercoastal Waterway, and they were all Varnums.
And they were very skilled at what they did.
Oh, absolutely. They built boats that 60, 70 foot boat, and they were used from all along the East Coast. People from Louisiana would even come up and buy a Varnum built boat.
How about that?
And the neat thing about it is none of the builders or none of the carpenters could read plans. If you'd have handed them a set of plans to build a boat, they'd have handed it back to you and said, go elsewhere. All of the plans were in their head, but they came out, and when the finished product was absolutely a beautiful boat, seaworthy, strong boats. And some of them are still in use today, even though the boat builders of that era have long passed away.
But those skills were passed from one generation to another.
Absolutely. Yes. And when my dad passed away this past November, he was in hospice, and he had been in hospice for a couple of days, and on Wednesday night, he passed away on Friday, but on Wednesday night, my sister and I were there, and my dad raised up in bed, and looked over at me and said, "Howard, when you build your boat, make sure you build it with juniper." I said, "Daddy, I don't have any plans to build a boat." He said, "Son, listen to me. When you build your boat, use juniper." I said, "Well, Daddy, can't I build it out of plywood?" He said, "Listen to me. Build it with juniper. And when you build and you put the bottom on the boat, leave a crack between the boards." He said, "Because when the boards swell up, they'll buckle,
Yeah.
and you won't have a smooth finish."
Yeah.
And that was our last conversation.
That's a touching
Him telling me how to build a boat.
That's a touching
Yep.
story. I like that a lot. Yeah. In the brief time we have, let's talk about the river.
Okay.
Let's talk about water quality, which is
Okay.
always a constant challenge.
Yes. Well, when I was a kid growing up, pollution was non-existent. I mean, the river was completely open.
Sure.
But now the development has come in on either side of the river, golf courses and all of that. The runoff comes in. The septic, if we had a countywide septic system, would be one thing, but it's not. They're all septic tanks, and you get runoff into the river. And now probably more than half of the river is closed because of
Who's the agency that would monitor that?
the Wildlife Resources Commission and the Marine Fisheries Division. They come down and they take water samples ever so often, and they regulate that pollution line, and they move it accordingly to the coliform counts that they get in the river.
But we still have good commercial fishing.
You still have good commercial fishing, but there's one thing that I'd like to add to the pollution issue. As long as there's good water flow, so it makes it important that we are able to dredge the river and dredge the inlet, because that increases the good water from the ocean.
Sure.
And that helps flush some of the bad nutrients out, and therefore that line is able to move because of that water flow.
Makes
coming
perfect
in.
sense.
Yes.
The use of good methods and good science
Yes.
to continue our commercial fishing.
That's right.
Yeah. So what's the long-term outlook for commercial fishing in general?
You know, compared to what it was in my earlier life, now it's probably only about a third of the boats and the people that are commercial fishing, because it's hard to make a living because of there's so many restrictions
Sure.
now. I mean, all the nets have to have fish extruders, turtle extruders. You can only have fish a certain size. If you catch fish too small, you have to throw them back overboard, and you can't sell them because of those kinds of restrictions. And the other thing is that it's so hard now to make a living that the younger generations are finding other job
I understand
opportunities rather than spending their life on the water.
But the demand is still there.
The demand is still there.
Yeah.
When my dad was a kid growing up on Ballhead, he used to say, and they had the Varnum fishing, they had the whole island as their fishery. My grandfather had all the fishing rights on Ballhead. And so my dad lived there until his early teens. They would catch so many shrimp in the nets, in the haul nets, when they were catching spots and mullets, they couldn't even give them away.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no sale for them.
Yeah.
And then later on in the late 30s and 40s, the people at Southport started getting into the shrimping industry and started shipping them off because there was no refrigeration or anything to preserve them.
Sure.
Later on, when Progress came in and they were able to preserve the shrimp and send them to New York or wherever, that was the birth of the shrimping industry in Brunswick County.
Well, Varnamtown's one little dot on the map, but one of hundreds on our coast, and let us hope that we continue to have Varnamtowns up and down the coast and all along.
It's a blessing.
Yeah.
It
Howard
really
Varnum,
is.
thank
Yes,
you so
sir.
much. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Jim, and thank you for coming to Varnamtown.
Yes, sir. Thanks.
I had noticed Lincoln Elementary School had a whole bunch of garden beds that were elevated, or not elevated, they were raised garden beds off the ground. One of their teachers had done a lot of work, and a lot of students, a lot of regular education students were out there working in these gardens during the morning, during the afternoon, and I just had the idea that none of our children in our special education department had access to that because they're so low to the ground. Some of our children with motor impairments that need wheelchairs couldn't access them either, reach them. So I started researching elevated beds for them to be able to do the same thing that their typically developing peers were doing. Right now there's 9 schools. One school got 2 beds, and then the other 8 schools got each 1 bed. Hopefully in a couple years every school's going to have a bed and multiple beds. First of all, they're learning a ton of things. In the beginning, it was just building, following directions, building these beds. In the accessible agricultural program, they're going to be learning basic parts. In middle school, it's different with Common Core standards. They're going to be learning basic parts of a plant, photosynthesis. And in high school, of course, it would be a little bit more advanced than that. But it's all about agriculture. So everything from following directions, planting, digging, using their hands, motor activities, what a plant needs to survive. It's so heartwarming. I want to cry every time I think about it. I do. I'm sorry. It just, you know, how generous AT&C has been. I've gotten grants from them in the past, a grant, but nothing like this. And just their support has, you know, we wouldn't have been able to do it without them.
We are here at the county-wide Robotics Celebration. We're at Brunswick Electric. My guest is Richard Berry.
Hi.
Richard, thanks for being with us.
Of course.
Now, you're one of a number of high schoolers who are here today. The crowd's still coming in. We have one of the several robots behind us, and we're eager to talk about robotics.
Yes, sir.
Tell us in your own words what robotics is all about.
So what it's all about is just trying your hardest to do something and going through multiple failures, but in the end, coming out stronger and learning about something, learning how to work with your team,
Right.
how to, you know, some people learn how to use new tools, learn new coding. Some people learn a lot of leadership skills.
Sure,
I've learned
absolutely.
in it. And overall, it's just a huge learning experience. A lot of the learning doesn't come from winning.
Okay. What is a robot? What's a robot?
So what a robot is it's a machine that's built to accomplish a task, and it's controlled by a computer that's on board it. And so
And it does a particular task.
Right.
All right. You've been involved in some of the countywide preparation and competition, am I right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Tell us about the robot that's just behind us.
So this robot, it's our team's robot. His name is Charlie.
All right. That's good.
And so what it is designed to do is it's designed to lift cubes like this one over here and to place them on top of seesaws.
So it's going to do a particular task, and the others in competition are asked to do the same task?
Right.
And whoever does it either best or quickest?
Yes, more or less.
Okay. I know it's more complicated than
Yeah,
that.
a lot more.
When I got here a few moments ago, I learned that these are not inexpensive.
No, sir, they aren't.
Okay. And one of the several aspects of your team is to raise the money in order to get the goods to build the equipment.
Yes, sir.
And that's not something I had thought about, frankly, and I had no idea they were as expensive as they are. Give us a cost figure for perhaps for this Charlie.
So probably in the several $1,000s, and that's on top of probably I'd say $3,000 to $4,000 for the robot alone, and then competitions end up costing upwards of $20,000 for
Yeah.
everything, just due to the transportation costs, having to actually join the competition.
Right.
It costs us fixed amount of money because they send you parts that are approved, and then a lot of other costs associated with it, like lodgings and stuff
Sure.
like that.
Well, our viewers will be as surprised as I am to know that this is an expensive proposition, and one of the things you have to do to be a team member or to have a team is to raise money.
Right. Almost all of our money comes from donations and sponsorships.
And we'll try to say good things about some of your sponsors and friends a few minutes later. I learned that you have 3 different subgroups on your team.
Right.
One of them we've already talked about a little bit, and that is a group to raise the money,
Yes, sir.
to raise the funds. All right, let's talk about the second and the third group now.
Okay, so the other 2 groups are build team and coding team. And so they're both very interdependent teams because it requires a lot of close working together. When you're building the robot, especially the electronics part, you have to take into consideration what can be coded and what the coders are capable of doing. And then likewise, when they're coding, they need to know what the build team is doing.
Right.
So that way they know what parts to code for, because not every motor can be coded the same way. There's like multiple different types of motors, all kinds of stuff like that that needs to be taken.
We talked about the 3 team. You have the fundraising group, you have the actual build team or the construction group,
Right.
and the coding group, which is CODING.
Yes, sir.
So we'll know. And they work together very closely and in an intertwined fashion. Before we went on the air, we talked about the coding. It's not your normal coding. It's complicated.
Right. It's called, the program that we use is called LabVIEW.
Right.
And it's not a, it's actually designed to be simplified for beginners, and it's a graphical programming language.
But I understand it's for engineers.
Right. When he said that, he meant engineering is in the sense that it's graphical, and so it's easier to get a sense of if you don't have the basics in syntax and understanding how to write code itself.
Right.
It's it's fairly good for beginners to learn.
Let's let our viewers know that there's competition.
Right.
And,
Lots of
and,
it.
and your countywide team is one team. Charlie is one of your products. And I'm assuming there is competition all over the country of this type.
There is.
In the school system.
The competition is actually a global competition.
Okay.
And at World Finals, there's teams from almost every country. I think there's, well, maybe not almost every, I think 70 countries in the last one.
Great.
And they've been expanding into more countries every year.
And what I learned is that you have a limited time period in which to build your robot.
Right.
And that you and your fellow students work 4 or 5 or 6 days a week during that period of time pretty
Yes, sir.
intensively to pull it all together. Tell us more about that.
So the time frame we have is 6 weeks to build the robot. We don't know what the actual task that we're designing a robot to accomplish is until kickoff,
Okay.
which is it's in early January every year. And we had a bit of a rough start with it this year due to all the snow delays
Sure.
and the icings of the roads. Because it is a school system run event, we couldn't work on our robot for the first week or so due to all the hazardous conditions on the road. And so we had a bit of a late start to it.
Had a catch up to play.
Right, we had a lot of catch up to play.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have 6 weeks to design, procure parts, and build everything and test it. And so we meet every single day after school at 3:30, and our meetings last till around 6.
So-
And then we meet on Saturdays from 9 in the morning till 3 in the evening.
So 3 or 4 hours a day, and then on the weekends.
Right.
When's your next competition?
We've actually finished up the competition season has ended for this year, and next year we usually time it with the school year. So meetings will begin again once the next school year starts, because this one is pretty close to over. So meetings are basically done for now.
Yeah.
Though we're still going to meet several times over the summer to try to work on outreach for starting like pipeline programs, which would be programs for younger kids to get them interested in robotics in the hopes that eventually they'll join our team when they're old enough.
Well, I know that you're proud of your teammates and
Yes, sir.
your robots, and you're engaging in a wonderful competition. We thank you for this brief period of time in which to interview you, and your folks are coming in as we speak. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having
Richard,
me.
Thank you.